Secretary Perez needs no introduction, but I will supply one nonetheless. Secretary Thomas E. Perez is the nation's 26th Secretary of Labor. His priorities for the department include ensuring a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, connecting ready-to-work Americans with ready-to-be-filled jobs, promoting gender equality in the workplace, ensuring that people with disabilities and veterans have equal access to employment opportunity, and insisting on a safe and level playing field for all American workers. Prior to being the Secretary of Labor, Secretary Perez was appointed Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Tim.
I want to start just with a very broad question, which is, we seem to be talking a lot about labor issues over the past year or two in a way that we weren't before. The Obama administration is talking about it more. This seems to be a moment for discussion of workplace issues. What has brought that about?
Well, I think the president's been talking about these issues from day one because the #1 domestic priority has been getting people back to work in good jobs that pay a good wage and have a pathway to the middle class. And so the first major piece of legislation was in terms of jobs, was the Recovery Act, and that really helped stem the tide of the recession. I've had an unmitigated. It's been a pleasure in this job and a privilege to be in this job because we're seeing economic growth. The economy is moving in the right direction. We've had 56 months consecutive of private sector job growth to the tune of over 10.5 million jobs. At the same time, we all know that there's some unfinished business, and to me the major piece of unfinished business is to ensure that the rising tide lifts all boats, because we're on pace this year to have private sector job growth that is about equaling what we were in the late 90s. The difference between now and then is in the late 90s, when we saw that significant growth and low unemployment, the rising tide lifted more boats. And what we have now is we're not lifting enough boats. And so that's why we talk a lot about what can we do on the wage front? What can we do to pick up the pace of progress for the long-term unemployed? And so the president, from day one, with the Recovery Act to now, where we're talking about the minimum wage, we're talking about overtime regulations, we're talking about how do we upskill America so that the jobs of the 21st century, which are good middle-class jobs that are out there, that people are able and ready to go into those jobs.
Let me just ask you about one of those. You mentioned overtime. I don't know if you saw, we ran a piece by Nick Hanauer a couple of days ago calling for changes to overtime regulation, and in fact there is a rule that will be coming out from the Department of Labor. Can you talk a little bit about how overtime has evolved over the years? It used to be quite a few more Americans qualified for it than do today, right?
Well, when I was a kid, growing up in Buffalo, and my neighbor was a manager, that meant that he or she, my neighbor's parents, mother and dad were a manager, that meant he or she was in the middle class. Today, that's not always the case. And in part, it's because our regulations and our wage and hour laws have not kept pace with inflation, and they haven't kept pace with the reality of the workplace. I meet a number of people who are working in the retail sector, for instance, 80 hours a week or 60 hours a week. They are on salary. They're making $25,000. In some cases, they're making even less than that. And you do the math, and we've had some cases where the manager, who is a salaried employee, so exempt from overtime, is making less than the person that he or she is supervising, and that isn't right. And people are understandably concerned about wage stagnation in this country, and that's why the president has instructed us we need to use every tool in our toolbox to address that, and the overtime regulation is one of those. And right now we have a threshold. You can work 80 hours a week or 60 hours a week, and the floor in that threshold is $455 a week. So you do the math, and you're something like $22,000, $23,000, and you're barely above the poverty line, and that's not right for someone who's working especially 60, 70 hours a week. And these are presumably the most valuable employees. These are employees with the keys to the store. And that's why the president directed us to take this on, because it's not fair. The American people deserve a raise, and in particular, these very valuable managers really deserve a raise. And that's what we're going to do next year.
Just between us, among all the people in this room and the live stream that we have on video, what's the new threshold going to be?
Well, we'll find out next year. We're still, we've been doing a lot of outreach. We've spoken to stakeholders across the board. We've spoken to workers. We've spoken to employers in a wide array of sectors, because this is a law of general application. So it applies in the IT sector. It applies in the retail sector. It applies in higher education. And so we always want to make sure that we build a big table and an inclusive process. And I've been very, very appreciative of the input that we've gotten. And so we're moving forward, and I anticipate that we will have a proposed rule out sometime early next year, and then we welcome additional comment on that proposed rule.
We had a midterm election recently.
I heard about that.
Democrats didn't do too well. They managed to lose the Senate, so now there's a Republican House and a Republican Senate. Is there any hope of legislation on minimum wage or any other labor issue in the next couple of years?
Oh, certainly. I worked for Senator Kennedy in the mid-90s. In 1994, the Republicans took the Senate and the House. And so you had the exact structure that you have now, where Republicans control both houses of Congress, and you have a Democratic president. What happened in the ensuing 2 years? Well, there was immigration reform, there was welfare reform, there was an increase in the minimum wage, there was a hate crimes bill, there was a very important health bill that related to, among other things, medical records privacy. And so a lot got done. And I saw that, and Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton working on the minimum wage. We have worked more recently on the reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Act, and that was done on a very bipartisan basis. And what I see across America, Tim, and I think this coming year we're going to build on the goodwill that we've engendered in this bipartisan work. People, I was in Tennessee yesterday, I was in Ohio last week. There is optimism across America in the employer community, and they want to grow their businesses. They are bullish about the future, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's healthcare, whether it's IT. And one of their biggest challenges is they need to make sure that they have that skilled workforce to compete for the jobs of today and the jobs of tomorrow. And that's another example of an area where we have a very strong bipartisan interest. The Workforce Investment Act is transforming how we deliver these critical services across the country and critical investments across the country. So I look forward to continuing to work on these issues. I look forward to continuing to work to advocate on the minimum wage. I think we can get a lot done in that area. When you have a transportation infrastructure bill, you are putting people to work. And again, Dwight Eisenhower is the guy who brought us the interstate highway system, and that's historically been a bipartisan issue. So I continue to have optimism. I know that the president has said repeatedly he wants to get things done. The American people in this most recent election said, we want you to get things done.
Mm-hmm. We are anticipating a statement later today by the president, an executive order on immigration. That will obviously have some impact on the working in the workplace. Do you have any thoughts about what immigration measures might do to wages?
Well, I don't want to get too far ahead of the president on what he's going to announce, so I can't really talk about the specifics of that. But what we do know, when we look at the issue of moving people out of the shadows and into the sunshine, is that it helps U.S. workers and it helps immigrant workers. There have been studies from Brookings, from elsewhere, that document that. And when you are, we have a robust docket of cases of undocumented immigrants who are exploited by employers. The Fair Labor Standards Act applies to anyone working in America. Your immigration status is irrelevant to the determination of a wage and hour violation. The reality is there are too many employers who exploit immigrant workers, and both legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants. And when you move people into the sunshine, you remove the incentive for that. And there have been a number of estimates about how the president's executive action will help lift wages. And I agree with that. What would help lift wages even more is comprehensive immigration reform. And there is no substitute for that comprehensive reform. And that's why we're going to continue to advocate for a bill along the lines of what the Senate passed over 500 days ago that still hasn't been acted on by the House.
Let's talk about enforcement a bit. There's enforcement activity under President Obama has stepped up quite a bit, it seems, and particularly on back pay. And there's been a targeting as well on misclassification of workers. Can you talk a little bit about what labor is doing in those areas and what it means for the economy?
Well, I'm a firm believer that it's important to have a good cop on the street and enforcing the laws and doing so in a fair and even-handed way. And it's important for workers, and it's important for employers who play by the rules. We get as many complaints from employers who play by the rules and can't compete because their competitors are cheating, and that creates an unlevel playing field. So what we've done in the Obama administration is we increased the number of investigators, and so we're able to do more and have a broader footprint. We have been far more strategic in the allocation of our resources. So we're using data-driven approaches, understanding where are the sectors where we're seeing the most exploitation. And so we've recovered over $1 billion in back wages on behalf of workers. We most recently, a few months ago, had the largest case that we've brought, at least, and it's the largest case I'm aware of, involving tipped workers. Almost $7 million involving a chain of restaurants in Philadelphia. That's a lot of tips when you think about it. And tipped workers are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. So we're continuing to do that. The issue of misclassification, I call it what it is. It's workplace fraud. There's a lot of employers who are trying to cut corners, regrettably, by classifying an employee who acts like an employee, quacks like an employee because he or she is an employee, and they're calling that person an independent contractor. They pay them lower wages, so the worker suffers. They pay no workers' comp, no unemployment insurance, none of that, and so Uncle Sam suffers, and they create an unlevel playing field. So that other employer who's playing by the rules can't compete. And I hear time and time again from responsible employers saying, we need you out there on the street because there are too many employers who are cutting corners. So I'm proud of the work that we're doing, both in the wage and hour context and in the workplace safety context. We, 30 years in the making, we finally got a rule out on coal dust. And one of the, I'd say 10 most memorable days I've had on this job was going out with our wonderful Assistant Secretary for Mine Safety, Joe Main, out to West Virginia when we announced it. And my major memory of that room was the sound that you could hear from the 100 or so people in the audience who all had an oxygen machine, who were coal miners, who are having trouble breathing, and they need the oxygen day in and day out. And one person said to me, I want to make sure, I'm struggling now, and I don't know how long I have on this planet, but I want to make sure that other folks working in the coal mines don't have to go through what I'm going through. And we came up with a sensible regulation that's going to protect workers without undermining the business. And in fact, the new protocols that were put in place, we just recently had the first set of testing under those new protocols. And contrary to the contentions of some who oppose the regulation, I think it was 98% of the employers were actually in compliance with the new higher standard. They were able to do it, and they're able to do it in an effective manner.
One story we've been following very closely in our vertical has been Chattanooga, Tennessee, right now, where they're experimenting with a European-style works council, trying to anyway. The UAW is that possibly opens the door for the UAW to gain collective bargaining rights. There's also a non-union player there called ACE. Very interesting, sort of unfamiliar territory. Do you have any thoughts about what's going on down there?
I do, and I spent roughly 3 weeks ago. I was in Germany and the UK, looking at their apprenticeship models, because apprenticeship is another example of an area where there's a lot of bipartisan agreement that we should lift up apprenticeship and create additional pathways to the middle class. And I spent the day at Volkswagen. Volkswagen is one of the 10 largest companies in the world. They have a global footprint in their manufacturing. One of the aspects of their corporate culture that is a key to their success is what they call co-determination. Workers have voice. Workers have a seat at the table. And they do that through their works councils. And the works council model, they have a manufacturing footprint in something like 20 countries, give or take a couple. And there are only 3 countries in which they have not employed the works council model. Only 3 countries where they have that manufacturing footprint: China, Russia, and the United States. I don't want to be in that company. I'm a big believer in the notion of worker voice. I was in Tennessee yesterday, actually, in Nashville, and I met with a group of employers who inspired me. I was at a place called Letter Logic with Sherry, who's the owner. She started out of her basement. Now it's a $30 million a year business. She's got about 60 employees, and I'd go up to their employees when she wasn't looking and say, "How do you like your job?" Or "What do you like best?" And they'd say, "It's like family here. You know, I have a voice in my work." You know, the Market Basket, a grocery chain in New England, there was a remarkable set of employee actions because people felt like family, and that was another example. And so I think worker voice is critical, and I think what's happening and what Volkswagen has done in their business model is incorporate worker voice, and I think that's really important. And I strongly support that. And I think there are multiple ways to ensure worker voice in America. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, a union town, and unions gave workers voice. And you know, the average, the median income for someone who's employed a union person is something like $200 a week more than a similarly situated non-union worker. So you know, if you ask me what I would want to do, I'd rather work at the Ford plant in Louisville, which is a union plant and pays more, and workers have more voice than, frankly, the Nissan plant in Mississippi, you know, where workers make less, they have less benefits, and less security. And so the model of co-determination, I think, is a really interesting model, and I'm a big believer that, you know, businesses are pretty sharp, and Volkswagen is one of the 10 biggest companies in the world, and we ought to learn something from them, and that's why I went over there. And I think this model has real promise, and I hope that we can figure out ways not only to sell their cars, but also to look at this model and see what application it has here in America.
Well, I have lots more questions, but I don't want to dominate, so I'd love to throw this open to the audience. I know folks out here have lots of questions for the Secretary.
Steve Caldera, Mr. Secretary. Nice to see you
Good morning,
again,
Steve.
International Franchise Association. The franchise industry, are creating 221,000 jobs this year. We're going to open up approximately 13,000 new establishments, $38 billion in new economic output. We provide incredible business ownership opportunities for minorities and veterans. We're honored by the White House and the First Ladies Joining Forces initiative. And so for the past 5 years, we've been outpacing growth of the overall U.S. economy. And you and I have discussed this before. So would you agree that the franchise industry is an important spoke in the wheel in terms of the continued U.S. economic recovery?
I think franchises play an important role in America. And in the course of not only our outreach on the overtime rule, but my general outreach to the business community, I've had some really productive conversations. And you know, what's interesting is I've spoken to a lot of folks who are in various sectors. And the thing that I've learned, Steve, is that in every single sector, I can give you examples of business owners who have been able to do well by their shareholders, do well by their workers, and do well by their consumers. That, to me, is the essence of what shared prosperity means in the 21st century. And you know, so there's a burger joint a couple blocks from here, Shake Shack. I don't recommend that you go too often because the first lady might get on you. But you know, I've spent time with Randy, who's the owner there, and he's expanding significantly. He's got a great business model. I think he's up to 50 stores now across the country. And you know, I talked to his workers, and he has been able to retain his workers because he pays a very good wage. And his first-line managers are making in the low 40s. They're not making $22,000. And that doesn't include incentives. He gives them incentives at the end of the month. When I was in Tennessee yesterday, I met 2 different restaurateurs who were part of this meeting I had with business owners. And one of them said, this is why I'm always inspired by my meetings with business owners. One of them said, I cannot, aside from the fact that paying well has meant that I've retained my employees, I am not comfortable, and this is almost a verbatim quote, going to bed at night in my nice house with the knowledge that an employee is having to survive on food stamps and housing assistance because I haven't paid that person a decent wage. And so what I heard yesterday from the business leaders that I met with, including folks who own, you know, multiple entities, was that there's a very strong business case for paying good wages because it's retention. It's the Henry Ford story. You know, 100 years ago, he doubles the wages of people on the assembly line because he had attrition over 300%. And especially for small businesses, the cost of training a new person is significant. And so that's why whether it's you know, Gina Schaefer, who owns the Ace Hardware store that's literally about a half a mile from here, all of her workers are making, you know, well above the minimum wage, whether it's, you know, the big box model in Costco, whether it's Randy and Shake Shack and others that I've met in the restaurant industry. I have optimism because I see all these business owners out there who recognize that it's a false choice to suggest that you either take care of your shareholders or you take care of your workers. You can take care of your shareholders, you can take care of your workers, and you can take care of your customers. That is the lesson of the Market Basket story in New England, where there was a sale of the company, or a proposed sale of the company, and the new owner wanted to completely change their business model, wanted to jack up prices, and you know who got up and objected first? It was managers who said, this is inconsistent with our bottom line, and it's inconsistent with our value, and you will lose business if you take this short-sighted approach. And it's a remarkable story, Market Basket, and it's not only happening at Market Basket. I am constantly inspired in this job by the interactions I have with business owners. And I'll give you one more story. The Gap took it upon themselves to raise the wage of their employees to $10.10. And you look at their applications are up 24% as a result of that. You know, millennials, they vote with their feet. They like to put their values in action. They want to be at places where they think that not only is the product they're buying good, but the people who are selling them that product are being treated fairly. I talk to millennials all the time who say, you know, I'm gonna be an educated consumer. And there's a lot of businesses who have figured that out and have built business models around that. So I appreciate your question, Steve, and I look forward to continuing to work with franchisors, with large business owners, with small business owners. We can build an America where there's a great return on investment for owners, and there is a fair wage being paid for workers. That's really the conversation we're having right now in this country. How do we ensure shared prosperity?
Next question.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your time.
Good to see you.
Todd Cranford with the Certified Financial Planner Board. I want to shift just a little bit the discussion. I think an important extension of the important issues that have been discussed this morning is about saving and protection of retirement savings. Because as we try to improve current conditions for workers, we also want them to be able to retire at some point. And I know that the Department is considering a reproposal of the fiduciary standard, and wanted to ask you to speak for a few minutes about what efforts you have been undertaking personally and where that effort stands now.
Well, as recently as about 5 or 6 days ago, I had another meeting with a number of industry stakeholders, because again, my philosophy when you're trying to do something in any space is that you've got to bring in all the stakeholders, understand their business models, explain and try and get an understanding of what the problem is and try to come up with a solution. And in this space, and the question that you're referring to is the space of retirement. And you know, I am a lawyer by training. I come from a family of doctors. I have 4 siblings and they're all doctors. And I bring this up because I think 3 of the most important decisions you make in your life are medical decisions. By the way, I had to promise them I'd never be a plaintiff's personal injury lawyer. They made me promise that. I think 3 of the most important decisions people make in life are medical decisions, legal decisions, and financial decisions. When you go to a doctor, there is an assurance that that doctor has a legal duty to put your best interests first. When you go to a lawyer, there's the attorney-client relationship, and I am legally bound when I'm advising my client to do the same, to make sure that I'm looking out for what are in his or her best interests. In the financial setting, we have a challenge because the financial planner that my wife and I use is a certified financial planner who has a fiduciary relationship. And we have a real comfort level with that. And we shopped hard. And we know that the decisions he's making, he has to put our best interests first. He also is making a good living. And we want him to do that because I want more people to save. And the challenge is that there are a lot of people who don't have that same obligation. If you have, there are some folks who are in this space who have an obligation to make sure that what they're selling you is suitable. Well, if I had cancer, I wouldn't want to go to the doctor and have him or her tell me, well, this treatment is suitable. I'd want him or her to tell me, what's the best treatment for me? And we have, regrettably, too many situations where people work a lifetime to build a nest egg. They go to someone who has a heck of a lot more knowledge and experience than they do. That's why they go to that person. And they go to that person thinking that he or she is going to be looking out for their best interest, and they end up in a product that is a pretty complex product that ends up with a lot of fees that are being generated when there could have been another product that was a much lower fee product that would have given you the same or better return. And so what we're trying to do is thread the needle and work with all the stakeholders to make sure that more people get advice, because, bless you, because I want everyone to get advice who's looking how to spend their retirement nest egg, and that the advice you're getting is in your best interest. Now, that doesn't mean you have to ban commissions, for instance, to give that kind of advice. You can figure that out. Our advisor, he puts us into products that are fee-based, and he puts us into products where he gets a commission. But in either circumstance, we know that he's looking out for our best interest. So that's the needle we're trying to thread. And the economic impact of conflicted advice is significant. And the challenge, and the reason this is so important, is that in my dad's days, and in my mom's days, and your parents' days, you know, everybody had that defined benefit plan, and it didn't matter. You know, you work 30 years, you get a retirement, and you don't have to think about this. Now we've transitioned to a significant extent to defined contribution plans. And when you leave a job, you're often asked, do you want to roll over your 401k? That's a hugely important decision. And we want to make sure that you make informed judgments. And I think all of us, and by that I mean consumers and financial planners, everybody has a shared interest in making sure that folks make informed judgments. And so that's what we're working on. That's the challenge. And we continue to reach out to folks, and we're getting a lot of good input.
I think we have time for just one more question. Sure.
Hi, Kristen Hernandez with the National Restaurant Association. I just want to go back to what you were saying before, being that you're talking to restaurant owners. You know, we are the nation's second largest private sector employer. We have we're an industry of 90% small businesses, whether you fly under the banner of a big chain, it could be a franchisee that owns 1 or 2 stores. So, you know, just to go back to what you were saying, wouldn't it be better for business owners to decide what works for their model, their business model, rather than put an artificial cap on wages? You know, I worked in the restaurant industry for years before I came to Washington, D.C., and, you know, the restaurant industry really is like a family. You know, I mean, employers want to do right by their employees, so wouldn't it be better to let them figure out what's best, what could work for their business model, rather than setting these artificial mandates?
Well, first of all, thank you for coming to this, and I very much enjoyed meetings I've had with the National Restaurant Association. I think that's about 6 weeks into my tenure when we first met. You know, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, I think, 76 years ago or so, and that's where the minimum wage was established. And it was premised on the following value proposition, which is that if you work in this country, you should be paid a wage floor that enables you not to live in poverty. That was the premise of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And over the ensuing decades, the minimum wage was raised in an effort to keep up with inflation. And it was raised in a bipartisan manner. Every president, except 2 since FDR, have raised the minimum wage. Most, you know, George W. Bush did it, his father did it, and many other presidents and leaders beforehand. And the reality today is that the minimum wage is worth 20% less than it was 30 years ago. And I know very few people that I could say, hey, do you want to, here, I'm going to offer you a job, but you got to take a 20% pay cut from what you were making when Ronald Reagan was president. And so that's the value proposition. And I also hear from my friends who self-identify as conservative, and they say to me, why are we subsidizing business models of certain businesses who are paying minimum wage, and as a result, their employees are having to survive on food stamps and other forms of public assistance? That doesn't seem right to me. And in fact, when you look at the studies, if you were to go to 10-10, you would end up taking roughly 3.5 million people. You would end up lifting them out of eligibility for food stamps. And that's just food stamps. And you would end up saving something like $4.6 billion a year in food stamp expenditures. And so I hear from my friends on the conservative side of the aisle, why are we subsidizing these business models? And I hear from my friends on, you know, who self-identify as Democrats or progressives, that we should continue to uphold the value proposition that was put forth. And there's no dignity in a 40-hour work week when at the end of the week you got to go to the food pantry to get your food. So that's the value proposition that from its inception has been embodied into the minimum wage. And I'd make one final observation. I was having a flashback when I was listening to your question about a restaurant owner in Brooklyn who this is the only restaurant that he owns, and they pay above the minimum wage. And they were telling me the biggest turnover item in a restaurant of his nature are dishwashers. And he's retained his dishwashers, and he was very proud of it. He's retained them for 18 months. And he did it because he'd been paying well above the minimum wage. And it really meant a lot to him, and it really helped the efficiency of his organization. And so I've always been struck by the diversity of folks who have said to me, and again, one of the guys who was there yesterday when I was in Nashville owns one restaurant. It's open from, I think, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., and there's a line out the door. Best burgers in Nashville, I'm told. And again, same thing. He has under 10 employees, and as a result of paying above the minimum wage, he's got a family at home, and he has a family at work, and it has worked for him.
Well, I want to thank Secretary Perez for coming, and thank you all for coming to our event. I think we've had some pretty interesting discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks so much.
Take care.